Let's dive straight into this explainer and unpack something we hear about all the time, but rarely break down to its core: the structural, deeply entrenched deadlock of the American gun crisis. Picture this. It's April 25, 2026. You're at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. for the White House Correspondents' Dinner. The elite mingling is suddenly shattered by the dry crack of gunfire, and former President Donald Trump is nearly assassinated by a Caltech graduate. Now, setting political motivations entirely aside, the sheer chaos of a moment like that forces a glaring question right back into the spotlight. Why is access to firearms in America so profoundly unrestricted? Well, today, we're going purely analytical. We are going to map out exactly why the United States is trapped in a permanent structural gridlock over personal weapons.
To really understand this, we have to start with the relentless rhythm of violence that spares literally no one. The wounds here are incredibly deep. Think back to 2012, Sandy Hook, which claimed 20 children who were just 6 and 7 years old. Then 2018, Parkland, where 17 lives were lost. Just 4 years after that, Uvalde, 19 more students, 2 teachers. And it just doesn't stop. Post-Uvalde, Washington, D.C. alone recorded 22 firearm incidents near schools in a single year. History keeps proving that this violence can knock on absolutely any door at any time.
And following these tragedies, we see a very familiar cycle. President Joe Biden really voiced the sheer frustration of millions when he pleaded for lawmakers to turn grief into action. The pattern is just so painfully predictable, right? A tragedy occurs, public outrage boils over, politicians step up to the podium with fierce promises, new bills get drafted, and yet, despite all of that momentum, the guns remain. The paralysis we're looking at isn't just a simple lack of willpower. It's a massive, complex matrix where money, power, and history are all tangled together.
So, let's peel back layer 1, the legal fortress.
The absolute deepest foundational block protecting gun ownership in America is the United States Constitution itself. These exact 27 English words, written way back in 1791, have effectively become an impenetrable legal shield. You see, in most countries, owning a weapon is treated as a heavily restricted privilege, but in America, it's an untouchable constitutional right, locked away inside the Second Amendment. Remember, the U.S. wasn't born in peace. It was forged in a revolution. To the Founding Fathers, a gun was the ultimate symbol of liberty, basically a failsafe against the tyrannical government. And that historical reverence created a fortress where almost any attempt at gun control is instantly challenged.
Now, for over 2 centuries, there's been this fierce debate over what those 27 words actually mean in practice. Proponents of gun control argue that the amendment was written for a young nation relying on local militias equipped with single-shot muskets, not as a blank check for modern citizens to own rapid-fire weaponry. But the modern Supreme Court has heavily favored gun rights. In 2008, the court actually struck down a D.C. handgun ban, ruling that self-defense is an individual right regardless of whether you're in a militia. And by 2010, they delivered a massive blow to local gun control by expanding that individual right to all 50 states.
Which means, to bypass that Second Amendment shield today, you'd literally have to amend the Constitution. And that requires navigating a mathematically impossible obstacle course. You need a 2/3 supermajority in the House. You need a 2/3 supermajority in the Senate, plus ratification from 3/4 of all 50 states. In our current era of hyperpolarization, getting that level of consensus isn't just difficult, it's practically a political fantasy. The mountain blocking gun control was quite literally built by the founders.
Okay, let's move to layer 2, the billion-dollar machine.
Because if the Constitution provides the armor, massive profits are providing the lifeblood. By 2025, the total economic impact of the firearms industry hit a staggering $92 billion. That is a 4-fold explosion in growth since 2008. Direct retail sales alone make up almost $20 billion of that. But when you factor in the supply chain, the taxes, the raw materials, you are looking at a massive economic engine. And obviously, industry leaders are highly motivated to protect their slice of the pie, so they translate those dollars directly into political influence.
Enter the NRA, which systematically weaponizes a fraction of this wealth to dominate Washington, D.C., essentially ensuring that gun control bills die before they ever even reach a vote. Over the last 3 decades, they've built this highly sophisticated lobbying machine. Direct campaign spending is capped at $25 million, sure, but then they've poured $72 million into direct lobbying and a massive $166 million into outside PACs. Ahead of the 2026 election cycle, they went all in, putting nearly $30 million behind Donald Trump. And the Republican Party is generally the primary beneficiary of this war chest.
But it isn't just raw cash that keeps politicians in line. It's this chillingly effective A to F grading system that forces total compliance. The NRA grades politicians not on their overall competence, but strictly on their loyalty to gun rights. If you get an A rating, it practically guarantees the fierce support of conservative voters. But an F rating, if you're in a pro-gun state, that is a political death knell. This creates this rock-solid alliance that safeguards the industry, keeping the political system entirely locked in its financial gravity.
Which brings us to Layer 3, the logistical nightmare.
Let's say you magically changed the Constitution and bypassed all the lobbying money. Theory suddenly hits a very harsh physical reality, the raw math of the streets. As of 2017, American civilians owned over 393 million firearms. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 1.2 guns for every single citizen, from infants to seniors. The U.S. possesses more civilian firearms than the next 9 countries combined. So when people casually talk about sweeping gun bans, they're often completely ignoring that the sheer physical presence of nearly 400 million weapons makes retrieval an almost impossible logistical task.
We hear about Australia's 1996 buyback all the time. After the Port Arthur massacre, Australia spent $300 million to successfully collect and destroy 650,000 guns. But when you compare that to the scale of the US, you see exactly why it's a statistical impossibility here. Applying that Australian model to 393 million guns is an unsolvable equation. Analysts have actually warned that forced confiscation in the US could spark widespread civil unrest. And even if it didn't, a total ban without full recovery would instantly detonate the black market. Millions of guns would just migrate from civilian closets to criminal syndicates, making them infinitely harder to track.
And that leads us perfectly into Layer 4, the loophole reality.
So what actually happens when individual states try to control this massive supply on their own? Well, because of America's federal structure, local laws are almost always neutralized by state border loopholes. California, for example, has some of the harshest, most restrictive gun laws in the entire country. But if someone really wants a weapon, they just have to drive a few hours into neighboring Nevada or Arizona, where the laws are notoriously loose, buy it at a gun show with no background checks, and drive right back home. When supply from neighboring states flows completely unchecked, the legal walls that places like California spent decades building just collapse. You simply can't have a secure state in an unsecured country.
And now, we've got modern 3D printing technology completely bypassing federal rules anyway. The debate used to be about pushing for stricter background checks at dealerships, like Biden's 2023 mandates, but whenever there's a law, someone invents a loophole. Aside from open-air gun shows, anyone can now literally manufacture a weapon with no serial number in their own garage. These are untraceable ghost guns. These technological and geographic loopholes essentially mean current legislative solutions are just patching symptoms, entirely unable to stop the actual supply.
So when you stack it all together, the legal fortress, the billionaire lobbying, the logistical nightmare of nearly 400 million guns, and these untraceable loopholes, you're left with a pretty sobering realization. This isn't just some fleeting security crisis. It is a gridlock deeply baked into the nation's framework. Between the ironclad shield of the Second Amendment and the physical reality of a country practically drowning in firearms, a virtually unbreakable cycle has formed. The specter of gun violence isn't an anomaly in America. It appears to be a chronic condition the nation has ultimately been forced to live with. It really leaves you wondering, is there actually a path forward, or is this simply the unchangeable reality of the American experiment?